Hello and the warmest welcome to the inaugural session of Brand Africa's Forum 2010. Thought leaders from all over the world have converged on Sandton here in South Africa to discuss issues that are core to our identity as Africans, especially Africans in the modern day. At the time of the historic FIFA World Cup tournament to be held here in South Africa used the mantra, bound by a common humanity. What we were trying to tell the world is that Africa in total is a continent of people with dignity, a continent of people with humility, and a continent of people with compassion. In business, we're talking increasingly about the African century, a new dawn for Africa, a new frontier. And as Africa, the sleeping giant, awakes, we want to know what message we should be telling the world. This is core to what we're discussing in this special session at Brand Africa Forum 2010. Let me introduce to you our panelists for this particular discussion. Matola is the CEO of the International Marketing Council. Mbele, thank you very much for coming through. Dr. Dambisa Moyo is the renowned author of Dead Aid and a director at Barclays PLC and SAB Miller. Dambisa, thank you very much for coming through. Simon Anholt is a nation branding policy advisor and author of Brand America. Thank you for your time. Thebe Ikalafeng is the founder and chairperson of Brand Africa, this initiative, and also the CEO of the Brand Leadership Group. And lastly, but certainly not least, Professor Hellicy Ngambi, the Dean at Unisa's College of Economics and Management Sciences. Thank you all very much for coming through. Ladies first, Professor Ngambi, what message should we be telling the world about where Africa is today?
The reality, we should start with the fact. Right now, the reality is that 61% of our population is in rural areas. We know that. We acknowledge also that 52% is our women. We acknowledge that of the 44 economically active population, 60% men. We acknowledge that we have gone through a process where we have demonstrated that as much as there has been Afro-pessimism, we can now say proudly that we have gotten rid of it. And that we know where we are. And because we know where we are, we can be able to rise above where we are. In terms of the crime level, poverty, in terms of the majority of our population being in the rural areas, now we have to say, what can we do? How can we leverage this image that we have created that Africa can do it? Africa is able. Africa has proven it. How can we leverage that benefit?
All right. Thebe Ikalafeng, what message should we be projecting to the world? We know where we are. Where are we?
Where we are, we're a nation that is entrepreneurial. We're a continent that is excited about its prospects. We are over 900 million people who are ready to take on the Chinas of the world, to take on the Indias of the world, and we are ready to acknowledge where we are weak and leverage where we're strong.
All right, strengths and weaknesses. As an outsider looking in, your SWOT analysis of Africa.
Well, your question about messages, I think, is probably the wrong question, if you'll forgive me saying so. I'm so sick and tired of messages. The problem with messages is that nobody's listening. And because Africa has a rather low profile, and because it's not highly regarded, that's the reason why people don't listen to the messages that it sends out. What is required is proof, demonstrations that this continent is on the move. And the proofs are there, but they're just not coordinated. They're not telling a story. They're not following a strategy.
Okay, Dambisa Moyo, nobody's listening, so it doesn't really matter to refine the message.
Oh, I think people are listening. I just think they're listening to the wrong message. I think the reality is Africa continues to be characterized by what I call in my book the four horsemen of Africa's apocalypse. It's characterized by corruption, disease, war, and poverty. That's not to say that there are not positive things happening across the continent, but clearly there is not a strong, credible, consistent message about this continent internationally. And I think that unfortunately the continent has fallen prey to having other people, particularly outsiders, people from outside Africa, paint and characterize Africa. And so because we've allowed other people to paint the story, we end up with a situation where the brand of this continent is not a positive one.
Mbele, an important word that she used there is consistency. We don't have a consistent message. Yes, there is the reality of corrupt leaders and bad leaders and poverty and devastation, but there's the other side. We need consistency.
Indeed, that's true, Lerato. We need consistency of messaging, but also consistency in what needs to be done to get Africa to where it needs to get to. And I think, as people have said, we know where we are. We need to do something about where we are. We need to start telling our story and tell the story as objectively and as balanced as we can. But we also need to address the issues that impede us from being successful as a continent. We need to take the lessons from those who've gone before who have done this well and make sure that we can turn the continent around. And I believe that it can be done. It takes time, but if the will is there, it can be done.
Simon, for Africans saying we do need a message, it needs to be refined, it needs to be consistent, it needs to celebrate the talents inherent to Africa, people will listen. Why is it you think people are not listening?
I've never seen any evidence of any country that has succeeded in raising its profile by telling the rest of the world how great it thinks it is. I've never seen an example that works. This is why I think the whole idea of nation branding is a monstrous scam and a wicked waste of taxpayers' and donors' money. It simply doesn't work. There are no case studies of any country that has ever moved the needle on its reputation through messaging. Countries are judged by what they do and by what they make, not by what they say about themselves.
Okay, let's talk about Africa today, because I also know it's problematic to look at Africa as a monolith. But let's look at the African continent today. Growth trajectory across the board, on average 4.5%, but you've got countries powering away nearer the 10% level, the Rwandas of this world, Uganda, for instance. You've got a young generation of African coming in from the diaspora, prepared to invest in their country. People who deal with private equity will tell you there's never been a time like now to bring your money to Africa. Despite the credit crisis, about $2 billion has come in via private equity channels. So something is happening here that's got the world excited.
Listen, I'm a little bit mystified by the gloomy tenor of the conversations today, because the reality is this train has left the station. We couldn't stop it now even if we tried. The fact that the elite audiences already know that they're onto a good thing if they're investing in Africa, the fact that the reforms in many, many places are starting to happen, it's happening. But I think it's right that people should be impatient for change, and I think that it's right that they should ensure that the train doesn't go off the rails and that it powers along as quickly as it can. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about creating a change that might one day happen. We're talking about speeding along change that is happening.
Dambisa Moyo wants to comment on this. Nation branding is a monstrous thing. How else do you sell your countries? Good things are happening in Africa, and we're sitting here today saying we want to tell the world, and we're told that's impossible. It's a ludicrous idea.
Well, actually, I beg to differ. I think the incredible India campaign that India launched about a decade ago has been transformational, certainly in the minds of people in Europe and the United States. To give an example, last year, I believe it was, there was a movie that came out called Slumdog Millionaire, which I think a lot of people really enjoyed, and it portrayed quite a negative side of India with the slum dwellers and so on. But the reality is that the Indian government, and actually the middle class and the elite in India, did not sit back and tolerate that. They stood up. The government, both in China and India, have said very categorically they will not allow their people to be portrayed in a negative fashion in the media. The reality is, where Africa is concerned, you only have to switch on the television internationally, and you can see that African children are constantly on television being portrayed as a figment of...
I know you want to argue this point, and you will do. If we can't use nation branding, what other tool is there?
The only tool is good governance and doing amazing stuff.
But it's happening.
Exactly, and it is happening. And
then they're not listening.
Oh, the reputation of Africa is improving every day as we watch. There are stories coming out of Africa today which simply would not have been listened to 5 years ago. It is happening. Let's be straight about that. But I want to just take issue with something that Dambisa said a moment ago. The Incredible India is a tourism promotion campaign. I have nothing against tourism promotion. They were selling a product there, which was vacations in India. That works. Of course it does. There are many, many examples to show that if you want people to visit your country as tourists, you do good marketing, and they will come. And if the experience is good, they'll come back again and they'll tell their friends. Nobody could argue against the good sense of that. But it's not the reason overall why the image of India is moving forward so quickly. It's not because of a campaign they ran.
It's because of?
Well, it's because of all the different things they're doing. It's because of the speed at which their economy is developing. It's because of the fact that you can't open a newspaper without reading that some Indian entrepreneur has become the second richest man in the world. It's because you can't turn on the television without seeing a Bollywood movie. It's a combination of many, many things.
But I think, Lerato, just what of interest when someone says it's a scam. If you look at his CV, the CV will say he's the father of nation branding. We need to organize the cops to come and arrest him. Because he's been running a big scam all these years, and now he's changing. But I think what perhaps he should be saying, is that, because as far as I'm concerned, it is important that we channel the right message, but it's also important that we get the channels. I think the problem with African Story is that we have not owned the channels all these years.
I want to bring Mbele into this conversation because effectively it's your job to sell South Africa, and post-World Cup, many people would say you need to take on the additional challenge of selling Africa. And we're told here, refine your message, good PR, get wonderful images of beautiful Africans doing beautiful things. It's not going to sell. It's the governance story that's going to get somebody's attention outside.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case, or anyone is suggesting that you've simply got to put PR out there and everything else will fall into place. I think we recognize that you need to address the fundamentals, whether it's the macroeconomic fundamentals, whether it's the structural issues in the economy, but at the same time, you need to be able to communicate this to any investor community. And the challenge we are sitting with on the continent here in Africa is that we tend to be broad-brushed with one brush. And unfortunately, even those countries that are reforming, they seldom get to be acknowledged. So how do we get a share of voice if that is not known?
Professor Ngambi, your views on this one. The media is one issue, and that's a channel, and we're going to discuss that. But the fact that we need to have credible examples of leaders who respect constitutions, businesses that operate in well-regulated environments, the rule of law adhered to, and that's when people will say, I'm taking my money to Africa.
Yeah, you see, you cannot just say, I think what he was trying to say, that it's not about what you say, it's about what you also do. Yeah. So in as much as you must say what you do, that's which is important, but just saying it for the sake of saying it that you're not doing anything will not take you anywhere. So we need to have the leadership that is ethical, for example. The leadership that is authentic. The leadership that knows the difference between amassing wealth for their own pockets and using it to develop the masses of the people.
Without absolving African leaders for the wrongs that they do and acknowledging those who have really pioneered, I want to deal with the hypocrisy.
Why are you looking at me?
You started it.
Your nation branding.
You started it. I want to deal with the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Russia
Yeah.
has absolutely no governance, no democracy. A president who becomes a prime minister is soon to become another president all over again. And people take their money there. And they go to G8 and people listen to them. Why do we apply different standards when it comes to Africa?
Oh, yes. Public opinion applies crazily varying standards all over the place. It's a great, great mess. I'm working in Mexico at the moment, and the Mexicans are constantly saying, why are we constantly portrayed in the newspapers as being the most dangerous country? Whereas, in fact, Brazil, which is universally adored, is probably a less safe place to live than Mexico right now. The reason is because stories about countries tend to take on a life of their own. And that becomes the story. And the media, I don't like this habit of blaming the media for everything, because the media may be partly to blame. But there is a fact about the media, that when they're telling international stories, when they're talking about other countries, the easiest thing for them to do is to find that old cliche and to latch onto it and to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And perhaps 90% of the media in the world simply reinforces the stereotypes and plays on them. Right. What Africa needs to do is to seek out that 10% whose habit and whose aim is to challenge the stereotypes.
Right. CNBC Africa, we challenge the stereotypes, but we're one of a few. And many people are saying the problem in Africa is that Africans don't own the media, and if Africans don't own the media, they don't own their own ideas.
Matter of fact, if you look at what the Chinese are doing, the reason the Chinese now are establishing their own version of CNN is for that particular reason, because they are saying we need to take control of the channel, of the message that goes out into the world. Because we're not just a bunch of people who scam other people's ideas and butcher other people's intellectual property. What we are, we're an entrepreneurial society. The same thing with Africa. We have pockets of excellence in media in the continent, if you look at it. But what we don't have mass excellence. And what we require is mass excellence. We require the mass excellence of the scale of the CNN, the scale of the BBC, and we need to be able to tell the stories from an African perspective, because that's how you begin to shape. So that is why I disagree with Simon when I say that the message is important, but it is not the only thing. But the message captures the essence of the proofs that are being developed.
Professor Ngambi, as we look at this fledgling media in Africa, indigenous media, and hope one day we will be in charge of our own ideas, what other channels are there for Africans to be telling their story authentically?
I mean, if we are able to connect, with other people, we don't isolate ourselves and also believe in ourselves. There's something that is about Africa that disturbs me. For example, we just have at the World Cup. I mean, we did everything that was possible, and we did it. We did it with our heads high. However, was that just a show, or is it something that we said thereafter? We are going to continue on in this vein. We are so much, about impressing, which I don't think we should be doing. It's not about impressing. It's about what do we do to ensure that Africa does develop itself to a level where they can compete equally with any other person, and be able to sit with everybody else, not just to show off, but to continue developing ourselves. By that, maybe can I just explain that? By that I mean, there's this African thing of antique. You can put something there for visitors. Let me just use that example. And so when a visitor comes, you show it off. Yeah. But no child of yours can partake of it. That is the mentality that we should get rid of. We must be able to say, this is something I want to use. My children, everybody else in this home must be able to partake of it on this continent, in this country, everywhere where we are. And then we will be respected by our colleagues. And we'll sell our story in that way.
Miller, during the World Cup, arguably it was a FIFA event hosted in South Africa, and we're constantly being urged to remember that. But there was a sense that other African countries could piggyback off the South African success. But in the marketing of the World Cup, in getting exclusivity rights for African companies to sponsor that event, there almost seemed to be many brick walls. And in the end, it became a South African event, and by default, other Africans could benefit. And I'm raising this question of divisions in Africa, that we don't often stand as a united continent with the same aspirations.
Well, indeed, if we need to change, the trajectory, the growth trajectory of Africa, we do need to work together. We need to coordinate. But if you're talking about the FIFA World Cup, indeed, that's an event that we learned quite a lot of things post the event, and we learned quite a lot of things as we were working through. So these are lessons that we learn for big events, to say, how do you negotiate the rights for these things well in advance? In fact, in Germany, they had lots of lawyers just working through the contractual obligations that to sign up for. So yes, indeed, those were some of the challenges, but I do not believe that as Africans and as African countries, we could not have taken more advantage of the event. In fact, there are corporations on the continent that took significant advantage of it. We are saying, however, that is not enough. With hindsight and with our learnings. The question is, what do we do? Should we be placed in a similar situation, not a FIFA-type event, but any other event? How do we broker rights, for instance, for the vendors who were moved away, some of them, so that they can also partake of the
I'm
benefits?
looking for a straight yes or no answer. In a variety of these fora, multilateral fora, I'm going to ask Dambisa in a second, do we go there with a plan? Or do we go in there as South Africans and then maybe there's a Nigerian there and maybe there's a Kenyan there and we'll make it up as we go along?
We do need to go in there with an African plan, if indeed it's an African initiative and effort. But yes, indeed, sometimes that is not the case. And you can look at issues such as regional integration. Just moving 500 kilometers from one area to the other, you might find different rules that apply. So it just presents a challenge to even coordinate and begin to have a uniform approach. Again, the point is that we need to overcome these hurdles to make sure that we can compete better as a continent.
Dambisa, moving beyond the World Cup and other multilateral fora, this question of Africa with a coordinated, unified vision. Let me ghettoize you, author of Dead Aid. Some African countries don't see anything wrong with aid. They say it's helping us alleviate poverty. And then some are aggressively pushing for trade and free markets and saying never will we allow ourselves to be seen as victims.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, it's been about 60 years since the aid system came into being. And based on logic and evidence, there is absolutely no proof anywhere on earth, not just in Africa, anywhere on earth, that aid leads to sustained economic growth and a reduction in poverty. Mm. We live at a time where we've seen over 500 million people in China and India moved out of poverty over the past 30 years. And we all know that that was not driven by the open-ended aid commitments that we're seeing across the African continent, which of course are unsustainable given what's happened in the more developed donor countries. The fundamental problem I see with the African continent is that not only do we not have a clear agenda with respect to what we should be doing to generate long-term economic growth and reduce poverty, but also the governments who should be taking the lead in branding, in leading the charge, in shaping people's vision of Africa, not just in the African continent itself, but also internationally, have taken a back seat. And this has left a vacuum for anyone and everyone to jump in, most notoriously, of course, the celebrities, to form an opinion about the African continent. Frankly, I mean, I wouldn't have an objection to the celebrities commenting about the African continent if they had something positive to say. But instead, they are the ones attending the most important and influential gatherings around the world with nothing but a negative message about this continent.
Let me just bring that to Miller. A friend of mine once said, I quote, "How would the US president feel if Amy Winehouse came to advise him on economic policy?" And the reason he said that is because we sit here listening to the Bonos and the Bob Geldofs advocating a different way for African economics. Where are the leaders? Where are African leaders?
Well, Lerato, we need several things to move forward rapidly as a continent. One of those is indeed leadership. But we also need bold vision to arrive at that. Thirdly, I'd say we also need to bring in the youth. I mean, it was said earlier that we have more than 60% of the people on the continent you find below, for example, the age of 24. So we need to bring in the youth as well into this. I do believe that those kinds of individuals, it is obviously sometimes in their interest to perpetuate a vision and image of Africa that has a bigger need than exists, because there is value for them in that. But at the same time, I think there is onus rest on our leaders to chart a vision and demonstrate leadership that will get us out of this morass.
I'll tell you where the leaders are. The leaders are poor and they're greedy. And because they're poor and greedy, when a Bob Geldof or a Bono comes to them and say, I'll give you a vacation at my house, will you give me the platform to tell the story about your country? They jump. So I think some of the issues that our Prof raised earlier in terms of being self-centered and self-interested, and that's the problem with the
then it takes us back to what Simon
leaders.
said, and then he's not wrong. It goes back to governance.
Governance has always been the tragedy of Africa. It's always known that. I mean, this is not a new story, and that is why governance is central to rebranding any nation, as many other aspects.
And I think another challenge that we have in defining leadership, we think leadership is about a position. So when somebody is in a
Exactly.
position, we are propping them and all that. We are not looking for skills, competences, values that would add value and bring about development, but we look at position, so which is misplaced. So even our definition of leadership is wrong. So I think we need to look at that as well.
Right.
Absolutely, and I think one should also think about leadership very clearly in the context of the nation. How do nations become respected, not because of how able they are to impress people, but by how much leadership they provide to people? And the fact of the matter is that wherever you go in the world, you find that all countries are beset by the same 20 or 30 major problems. They're problems that everybody is familiar with. The question that Africa should be asking itself today is not how can we best show off to people in rich countries, but how can we make our existence on this planet worthwhile? How can we make people in other countries thank the Lord that Africa exists? What is our contribution? What is Africa for?
Dambisa Moyo, let's pose that question to you. What is our contribution? Because if we're a country or a continent beset by socioeconomic problems and challenges, some are heavily dependent on aid, and you've made your views very clear. Others charting a new way but not finding the technical support, not having enough technocrats to advance the aspirations that we have. What's the direction going forward?
Well, the reality is, I believe that we are not on the right track. Yes, there are pockets here and there of glimmers of hope, but fundamentally, this continent is what Paul Collier, who is my PhD supervisor, called shearing off from the rest of the world. We are, in many countries, there's not even a plan that maybe we can discuss execution on. They simply do not have a clear agenda on the key sectors that will drive economic growth: education, healthcare, infrastructure, for example. This continent needs to grow at 7% a year, according to the United Nations, in order to put a significant dent in poverty. You rightly pointed out it's growing at around 4%. It's to have those targets and for us to pump our chests and say, oh, we're doing a great job, is a complete waste of time. The reality is there are more poor people on this continent than there were in 1970. 70% of Africans are living on less than $2 a day. We've got, as was said earlier by Miller, over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. It's simply not good enough. Africa represents less than 2% of world trade, less than that of what Spain contributes. So we've got fundamental problems, and to sit here and say we're on the right track is complete folly. We've got issues of corruption that are still rampant if you look at Transparency International Index. We've got issues with respect to doing business. We know that engine of economic growth has got to be business and investment. Nobody wants to invest in an environment where there's rampant corruption, there's a lack of infrastructure, and clearly where there's a place, there's no clear agenda from the government.
Miller, looking at the statistics that have just been put forward to us, and then adding to that the fact that in the 21st century, Africa is now competing head-on with the Chinas, with the Indias, with the Brazils, and then the next tier, Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, countries that seem to have a game plan. What do we do?
We do need a game plan. There are plans in some parts of the continent, and I do believe that we need to focus on obviously sharing what is best, and on the other hand, ensuring that issues that you have raised, like governance, leadership, etc., are taken care of. I believe Africa has a contribution to make. We cannot stand back and say Africa does not have a contribution to make. And I believe that that contribution starts with each one of us here on the continent. We have this Brand Africa Forum today. If we agree that you need to build a country's brand equity, you need to focus on the socioeconomic fundamentals as well as on the image, then we need to be able to say, what are we doing about those socioeconomic fundamentals in those parts of the continent where those are challenges? But we also need to be able to say, how do we build the image of those countries on the continent that are seeking to make reforms? 2/3 of the countries on the continent have made some impact in terms of reforms. Right. How are we contributing in making that
Thebe, is it enough to say, these are the reforms, these are our pledges, these are our plans? When you are up against China in tourism, in industry, for export, for trade, that a country that in the last 20 years has managed to emerge as the second largest economy in the world developing its human capital, and you still have infrastructure problems adding to the cost of business by 40%. Is it good enough to say we have reforms?
Well, I think if there's one thing you will note about China is the level of involvement of the government in contributing to the resuscitation of China. What you're struggling with in Africa, in the continent, and not the entire continent, I think that's also a mistake that we make, that we generally do paint as well when we speak. We paint everything with one brush. There are pockets of excellence within the continent. The challenge that we have here is we do not have the same level of governance or governments, if you will, from one country to the other. What China has been able to do, they've looked at themselves, they said, we're not just 2 billion people. We're 2 billion people who've put a government in place, and that government has to do something that's good for the continent. Our challenge is that how do we bring together 53 organizations around the table to have the same agenda, and have those 53 must work with their 900 million people and say, together we are not going to, and we're not going to overpay the leaders and underpay the people, but what we are going to do, we're going to suffer together, because that's why China has been able to do as well as they've done.
Professor Ngambi, I think the issue here is just plain and simple competitiveness. We don't have what they call the big match temperament. When it's time to cut to the chase, we're just not doing enough, or we don't have what it takes.
Well, we have what it takes, but we just don't use what we have. I think, like I was saying, that we know our status quo. We know where we are. So we must say, what are the competences that we have? I mean, there are so many Africans all over the world that make contribution elsewhere, not even in Africa. They go elsewhere to make significant contribution. And we let them go because we don't have the eye for talent. We don't have the eye for potential. If we can start there, that's why I like that theme of one goal. If we can start right there at the beginning, where it matters the most, and start changing the values, the perceptions, the way that people look at each other and the development and the future, we can be able to leverage the competences that we require to take Africa where it ought to be.
Just another comment on the Africans who are going out. More often than not, those Africans also live with the money instead of keeping the money in Africa. And that's also been one of the biggest challenges and the problems that we have in this continent.
All that's been said here says to me, the Africans don't even believe in Africa. What do you think?
Well, all I can say is that you've got plenty of company. I think I've probably worked in 43 countries over the past 20 years, and only 3 of them do not suffer from low self-esteem. If you want to know which 3, it's the United States of America, Sweden, and Kazakhstan. Yeah? Groucho Marx said, I would never belong to a club that would have somebody like me for a member. All but 3 of the countries I've worked in suffer from Groucho Marx syndrome. Most of Africa is no exception to this, but I've never seen a way of fixing that except by making these kinds of projects work. You can try and do social engineering till you're blue in the face and say, be proud, be proud. It often doesn't work. Something like the World Cup can be very helpful, but in the end, what makes people proud of where they're from is the prospect of them being admired by people from the outside.
Talk to us about your American experience. What have they done right? Okay, pre-Iraq. What is it they've done right?
What's basic? This requires a 200-page book. It's called Brand America. You can buy it at most good bookshops. The story of Brand America is the story of a country which, unlike most, was created with a purpose in mind. It was created deliberately because they knew what they stood for and what they wanted to achieve, and they've kept that up more or less without a break for the best part of 300 years. Fundamentally, that's the recipe. It's also a culture which praises and rewards innovation and high-quality education. In the end, everything comes back down to those things. If you have the education and you also have a society where innovation is rewarded, everybody trying to do new things, sending them out into the world, that in the end is what creates a society, a country which is admired. Mainly what America has got is that it's way beyond a brand. And this is one of the reasons why I dislike the word brand. A brand represents a childish stereotype, an idiotic reduction of something rich and complex into a simple formula. Africa's problem is that it's branded, America's asset is that it's way beyond a brand. You ask people, I interview people all over the world, what do you think about different countries? You ask anybody anywhere about America, and they will rabbit on for 35 minutes about America, contradicting themselves left, right, and center. It's a bully, it's liberal, it's rich, it's poor, it's fair, it's unfair. That's a real country with a real reputation.
Dambisa Moyo, before we take an ad break, just give us some thoughts as to how we can fix it. Psychologically, so that we are patriotic and bullish about Africa. Technically, that we're attracting the necessary skills to Africa. Constitutionally, that we're holding our leaders accountable. And in a development trajectory, that we are investing in Africa and not taking the money abroad.
Well, I think it has to be incredibly aggressive. As I said earlier, we've had 60 years of a formula that has not delivered, certainly in terms of economic prosperity for the majority of Africans. And I think the reality is, if you looked at 60 years of a political party or 60 years of a business, it would never be allowed to stand for as long as the aid system in particular has lasted in Africa without delivering its results. My fundamental thesis is I believe this attitude of aid dependency and the culture of free handouts from the international community that has even allowed African governments to abdicate their responsibility of providing public goods such as education and healthcare and national security and infrastructure has left a culture where not only are we in a cycle where people expect Africa to be a drag on the rest of the world as a pity play, but more than that, it has allowed the world to, it's allowed African leadership to look out to the world and go with pride and dignity to beg. It's a psychological issue here. And until the leadership is either given a carrot towards improving the brand of Africa or punished by removing this comfort of aid, I don't believe we're going to see a change on this continent.
We're taking a short break right now. When we come back, we'll be getting more insights here from Brand Africa 2010. We're dealing with the reputation of Africa, the image of Africa, and boosting the economic competitiveness of this continent. A whole range of issues have emerged here, from flaws in leadership to a disbelief, for lack of a better word, by Africans in their own merit. And it's about restoring what is wrong. You're watching CNBC Africa. We're at Brand Africa 2010. We'll see you after the break. Welcome back. You're watching a special broadcast coming to you from Brand Africa, the inaugural forum here in Sandton, South Africa. We're discussing issues of re-imaging Africa and whether or not we're pushing forward the right messages and pursuing the right strategies for growth to attract investment and essentially to uplift our nations. Our panel is comprised of Mbele Matola, who is the CEO of the International Marketing Council. We have Dr. Dambisa Moyo, the author of Dead Aid. We have Simon Anholt, who is the CEO of Brand Leadership, the CEO or the author of Brand America. We have Thebe Ikalafeng, who is the founder and chairman of Brand Africa. And lastly, we have Professor Hellicy Ngambi, who's the executive dean for the College of Economic and Management Sciences at Unisa. We've got a very short bit of time this session. Let's just talk about solutions going forward. Mbele, the whole idea of consistency in the messages we put forward, what are we going to do to fix it?
Well, it's not a question only of consistency in the messages, as we've discussed earlier. It's about also a concerted effort and consistent effort in addressing the issues such as the macroeconomic environment, the policies, and being able to communicate those. And I believe that's the only way we can do that. I've indicated that we need, obviously, leadership, and by leadership it's not positional leadership, but it's where people take active involvement or, active citizenship in bringing about the change that's required. We have in South Africa currently a campaign that's running which says Lead SA, and anybody makes a contribution because we're seeking to achieve a better society. It's about a bold vision to say these things can be done. I refuse to accept that Africa is a basket case. I believe that we can turn these things around. It needs those things.
Dambisa Moyo, we want to move beyond aid. I agree with you, it's dead. But how do we bring Africa back to life?
Well, I mean, the good news is that we have examples on this continent. We have examples of places like Ghana, obviously the extreme examples like South Africa and Botswana, but the new upstarts, Ghana, Rwanda, are showing that there is a different way. Ghana has gone to the international capital markets and issued debt in the capital markets. Rwanda, the government has been very explicit about cutting back on waste in the public expenditure, but also has made a very public commitment to reducing its dependency on aid. These are countries that have a clear vision, a clear plan, well articulated, and they're obviously very serious. I think it's important for us to continue to showcase those success stories, and at the same time, we need to get on board the ones that are failing, and of course there are many, the obvious ones without needing to be named. On the whole, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a 7% GDP per year, that target. We are not meeting that target yet. There's a lot of work to be done and it needs a lot of seriousness from government.
Simon, synthesizing the message beyond nation branding, you say just do it, stop talking about it. We know what we ought to be doing, but we've also been told we need to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to carry on disputing that last bit until my dying day. You see, I think that with visionary and imaginative leadership, business and political and civil society leaders who know how to use their imaginations, who know how to make policies, make products, make innovations that capture the imagination, that are different and new and extraordinary. That's what you need. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about messaging because that's what the media wants to talk about. I think in the end, if you want a formula, countries have to develop the systems and the structures in order to project a constant, unbroken stream of dramatic evidence that they really deserve the reputation they desire. And very few, in fact, none of the African countries that I've looked at have got anything like those mechanisms.
Thebe, we talk about creating an enabling environment for the private sector because ultimately it is not the government that's going to create jobs. It is businesses, it is entrepreneurs who create jobs. That they can leverage the African brand. What is it that they ought to do? Want to create African brands where African companies and African products can be sold to the world and can be celebrated internationally. And we can look at that and say, wow, that's an African.
I think we've got excellent examples of the MTNs of this world, the Standard Banks, the Old Mutual, the Investex, Owandos, Owando, the Zenith Banks, and etc. around the world, around the continent. We are seeing evidence, we are seeing proofs that Africans can do it. What we do, we need mass entrepreneurs, we need mass armed struggle. You know, we have an armed struggle for political emancipation. What we need entrepreneurial struggle. Yeah. That's what I wanted to say. We need to have masses of Africans not begging, but Africans saying that I can do this myself. I can create this. If you look at what makes America great, it's made great by a Harvard dropout who goes and starts out a little startup business which becomes the standard in the world. And that's what Africans do. What we do and what we struggle with a sense of belief. And the most important thing is what Fela Kuti says, if I must identify with Africa, then I'll have an identity.
Professor Ngambi, institutionally, the leaders have to create the regulations, the laws, the environment for these entrepreneurs to come forward. The banks have to provide the credit facilities. But ultimately, governance, our leaders must respect those constitutions so that we can respect them. How far do we have to go?
I think we have to create a leadership that I have come to coin as rare. A leadership that is responsible, that is a decisive leadership by rare, rare as in rare, R for responsible, A for accountable, the other R for relevance, and E for ethical. I think if we can have that rare kind of leadership, the governance issues will have been taken care of. Because we'll be responsible for the 61% who are in the rural areas. We'll be responsible for not by imitating, but originating. Mm-hmm. We'll be responsible to each other, and therefore will not be able to be caught into what I call the toxic leadership kind of leaders that we have.
And literally in 20 seconds, each of us on the panel, competitiveness Miller, that's another core issue. We are not just Africa in isolation. We're now Africa in an emerging market space. We've got to be growing above 7% to make a difference. We're not doing it right now. But as we strive to do it, we've got to face up to the fact we are up against Brazil, Russia, China, India, Indonesia, South Korea. You name them. They're out there and they're playing hardball.
True that. We've agreed that there are issues of governance which need to be addressed, but we also believe that there are issues around education, around innovation, around productivity that are required. For Africa in particular, to compete with those big giants, your Chinas, your Indias, we need regional integration, because then size matters in that regard, and we can start to compete.
Dambisa, competitiveness?
Well, again, the good news is that nobody's asking Africa to invent a wheel. All you need to do is copy. Regional integration, critical. Still, we're too fragmented, too many small countries unable to compete. My own country, 10 million people in Zambia, 12 million people. You put Zambia and Southern Africa, all of a sudden you're talking about 150 million people, so a completely different proposition. The other thing is, look at the World Bank's Doing Business Around the World survey. 60% of the bottom 50 countries are in Africa. Doing business on this continent remains a nightmare for many people. In some countries, it takes up to 2 years to get a business license. This is not a formula for economic success, particularly building on what Thebe said earlier. The government cannot create jobs, certainly not to fill the population that we talked about earlier. We need the private sector on board. Right. And until we get the right policies in place to attract foreign direct investment, but also to encourage Africans domestically to want to invest in this continent, we're not going anywhere quickly.
Competitiveness, Simon?
Education. We're talking about generational change here, and the way that you achieve this generational change is by bringing up a generation of children who believe in themselves and who believe that by making good, new, original stuff is the best thing they can do.
Thebe?
Innovation. We've got to be innovative. We've got to be innovative, and I know what Dambisa says, we have to copy, but I think we have to start creating ideas. But another thing that's important is we also have to believe in African products. The biggest problem with Africans is that we only reject what is African. So we need to believe in our products, because that is our distinction. That's what makes us different everywhere else in the world.
You must lose that Louis Vuitton scarf.
Yes.
I will.
Competitiveness.
We need to leverage our strength. There are some many areas that we have identified where we are strong. We have got the resources. We have what it takes. We need to believe in ourselves. We need to know that we can do this and go ahead and be responsible, accountable, relevant, and ethical to each other and to everybody around us. And we'll do it.
Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. I'd like to open this discussion to the floor. Yes, sir. There's a gentleman behind Schultz.
Right, my name is Anthony Beeler from HDI Youth Marketeers. I think I heard a stat about 60% of Africa's population being under the age of 24, but today I think I've failed to hear or see even representation of people under the age of 24 giving their voice, giving their opinion, because I think that's where a lot of the change is going to come from the youth, from the people with the new ideas, the innovation, the initiatives. So I want to know from your side, what's being done to galvanize and to implement these changes and to involve young people to make Brand Africa live, really?
Well, this being the inaugural Brand Africa Forum, what we are taking away from you is that, the next panel and our next one will look a lot more different, because we do recognize that we need to involve the youth.
Anybody else want to say something about the youth, engaging the youth in Africa?
Well, I'm 23, but I'm not African. So.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Chichi Maponya Group, and Brand South Africa board member. I wanted to first make a comment that Africa has contributed to the global economy. We've given resources to the wealth of the world, and we should recognize that. And the many technocrats that are in the world making the world grow, who are in the diaspora, originally from Africa. That is our contribution. We must also recognize that. But my question is about how and when. How can we begin to have an African message, a coordinated African agenda, African message, using the trade platforms that we have in Africa and using the African Union. You know, there are those, how can we begin to forge a common message, and by when? When can we put timeframes to say, you know, these are the milestones that we want to achieve, and by this time? Thank
Multilateral fora and consistent message.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, first of all, I think, I don't know, if we're not doing it now, I don't know what we're waiting for. I mean, hopefully not an engraved invitation, because as far as I'm concerned, you know, this is, as I said earlier, 60 years on, what are we waiting for? It's time to start doing that now. I think in terms of these big institutions such as the AU and so on, you know, in theory, these institutions, we understand what their relevance is. But the reality is, as a Harvard professor says, you know, we all know that eating well and doing exercise keeps us in shape. It all boils down to execution. So I think we've had enough conferences, we've had enough reports written about Africa and the issues and trade and investment and the need for proper governance and reduction of corruption, education, healthcare, infrastructure. The lists are long. But the fact of the matter is we're still falling down on implementation. We need execution here. As I said, I don't see what we're waiting for. I think part of the point of being here today, certainly for myself, is that I want to be part, and I think many people in this room would like to be part of something that is actually putting into practice and executing on these issues.
What we learned from the World Cup was that there was a goal with a time frame, there was a reward for reaching that goal, and there was a sanction if we don't reach that goal. I think the central point about aid, which Dambisa has made, is that the problem with this continent has been that there has not been those milestones. And when it comes to central messaging as well, it's the same thing. The time is now, but there must be a sanction if we don't do it right. And of course, we all have to understand one thing. We're all in this together, because if anyone fails, we all fail.
My personal view, for what it's worth, is that setting about trying to change the overall image of the entire continent of Africa is probably a task of a very, very high order indeed. It seems to me that the problem at the moment is the image of the continent of Africa is dictating the images of the individual countries, and that's unfair. It needs to be the other way round. The only way that Africa as a continent can change its image is if certain individual countries, the front runners, manage to drive a wedge into that monolithic negative image and start showing the individual countries doing remarkable different things with their own identity, their own culture, their own history, their own assets, their own heroes. That's the only thing which will start to break up this monolithic negative image. And then the image of Africa will derive from the individual images of the countries, and that's the way it ought to be.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is a resuscitation dose for Simon. Before we had the World Cup, one of the key messages that went out was that Africa is ready, South Africa is the stage. And one of the key things that came out from our government was that we will then ride behind NEPAD. Now the question is today, how does Brand Africa leverage on structures such as NEPAD, African Union, and SADC structures to increase competitiveness of the continent?
Well, it's interesting because in a way I'd have given the same answer to that question as I just gave to the previous one. So rather than repeat myself, I'll hand that over to the others.
Okay, our regional bodies, Professor?
I was just thinking, well, not that question, I was just thinking in terms of what we just said. I think one of the challenges that we have, we reward mediocrity. If we can stop that and start saying, look, unless you have really excelled, we'll reward you. If we say you must score 10 goals, we shouldn't be recording you. I mean, we shouldn't be rewarding you if you score 2. We shouldn't be celebrating that. I'm just giving that as an example. In organizations, we do that. We reward mediocrity. So as a result, we celebrate it, and so people continue in that mediocrity and never reach high levels of excellence and high levels of being competitive in terms of contributing, so that we can be able to develop the individual organizations, then the individual countries, then the region, then the continent. Once we do that, I think we'll be able to go far. But we must define what is excellence.
Right.
Unless we do that, because then we'll be continuing to reward mediocrity and will never rise above. And then believe in what it is that we do. We believe in ourselves. There's a saying that if you see yourself as a grasshopper, so will other people see you like that. So we must change the perception of ourselves as well.
Okay.
The tragedy of these many political formations you've talked about has been that in the main, there have been a lot of talking shops and there have been a lot of buddies. Because if you look at what happens with many of them, when they have to take a tough decision against a member body, they've always danced around the idea. And that's the reason that you have initiatives which are independent, like a Brand Africa, because the purpose of initiatives like this are about private sector taking the challenge themselves in terms of how to reverse the negatives of the continent.
Okay, on that note, we're going to have to close this session down. I'd like to thank Professor Hellicy Ngambi for just providing us with some insights, and I'm very, very grateful for what you said there. I think it's a poignant place with which to end. We should stop rewarding mediocrity in Africa. We should reward excellence and define excellence. Thebe, Ikalafeng, thank you very much for establishing this forum, organizing it, and creating a platform for us to dialogue. But we need to start looking at the solutions. Africa needs those solutions. And thank you for a lot of the insights you've put forward. The chairman of Brand Africa's initiative and the CEO of Brand Leadership, Simon Anholt, Nation Branding Policy Advisor and author of Brand America. Thebe says that's what you are. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming through and just provoking us to think outside the box. Dr. Dambisa Moyo, author of Dead Aid and director at Barclays PLC and SAB Miller. Thank you also for giving us some economic insights on what we could do better and that the time is now. There's no point waiting for an invitation. Just do it yourself. Africa. And Miller Matola, the CEO of the International Marketing Council. Thank you also for encouraging us to celebrate what we've already accomplished thus far. Thank you for joining us. Thank you at home for watching CNBC Africa. We're first in business worldwide.